And good morning. I am Walter, and I'm the Dutch Mentor. On YouTube, you can find me at Fly with the Dutch Mentor. I have been a private pilot fixed wing for almost 20 years. And more recently, over the last year and a half, I obtained my private helicopter, my helicopter IFR. And now I've graduated and successfully passed my helicopter commercial check ride, both the oral and practical. Uh, it's been quite the joy and ride. I've tried to video document the entire experience of my helicopter, private, instrument, and commercial, and I will continue to do so as I obtain my IFR rating. One thing of my CFI rating. The one thing is I was a little surprised about is that if you go online, there is absolutely nobody that has posted a debrief around the commercial, or for that matter, even the private, but especially the commercial check ride oral exam. There's examples of the practical, which are certainly very helpful, and I would encourage all of you to watch that. But there was no example of what a helicopter check ride oral exam would look like and what kind of questions you are facing and how to prepare for that. So in today's video, it is a longer video than I normally would do. I would like to go over the expectations and how I prepared for this and what kind of questions I had to field during the exam itself. And hopefully that will give you some insight in how to prepare and how to ace it. I will tell you that I have been a person that has really been fully committed to self-studying all of the ground along the way, and I've had some checkpoints, of course, with my CFI, but all of the tests, and I've completed all of the tests, the FAA required test, all the way through CFII at this point in time, including all the ground school. I've completed at my own pace, in my own way, which gave me a great depth of knowledge. So it's all stuffed into the brain. The only deficit I really felt right up front, and I need to be very clear about that, is that be able to extract the information out of your brain and to be able to articulate that during the oral exam is something where I need to continue to work on. And certainly I'm looking forward in the CFI portion to be able to present lesson plans and to get better and better at being an orator, being an educator, being a teacher, and to show the depth of knowledge. So it is important that as you prepare, that you don't do this just in a vacuum. Make sure that you find somebody who has either been through it or is going through it and practice how to answer questions in a cohesive way and how to make it sound like you actually know what you're doing. My father taught me a lesson a long time ago that you only are an expert or certainly somebody who has knowledge in the area if you're capable of teaching the material. So with that out of the way, I would like to go to the standard form that all of us will receive that comes right out of the PTS standards on what the examination, what topics to cover. And I think it is fair to say that the exam can take anywhere from an hour and a half to 3 hours, depending on the DPE. And of course, it depends on your level of knowledge. If you're able to clearly articulate and you don't, the DPE is less likely to go deep into the subject matter. Or, if you struggle, then they would want to, also dig a little deeper for the fact is that the sea of that knowledge is there. Again, at no point did I feel I was being tricked with questions. I think it was very fairly presented to me. There was time and room for me to think, time and room for me to check my resources, which is all appropriate because one thing as a pilot, we are, and we should be dependent on checklist and not just on memory itself. And I think that's a big distinction that people sometimes forget that you need to stuff all of it in your brain and remember 50, 60 different acronyms for all the different types of scenarios. And that's plain and simple not true. We need to know where the resources are. We need to be able to check these and not have to search for hours to find an answer. So it's quite okay. So the first thing to do, and I would highly recommend that, is when you go into the room and set it up in a way that shows the DPE that you have all the resources you need available. So make sure that you have a far aim. Make sure that you have a regular chart that's up to date and current. Make sure that you have a helicopter chart available. Making sure that you have your supplements. Making sure that you have your checklist, a notebook with a pen a calculator, an iPad with ForeFlight, so you can do both a paper chart review as well as a ForeFlight review. I would even recommend print out your briefing of your weather for that particular cross country that you have planned. All these things show that you have put real thought into it, and it shows you have organization. Don't put it all in one pile. Spread it out into neatly placed sections on the table, and again, it shows you that you have some handle on resource materials and management of lots of information, which is of course what these oral exams are all about. So again, the category on the paper, on the PTS, where the examiner will go in, are laid out in the areas of PAVE, right? So it is about aircraft, pilot, aeronautical, medical effects, and then of course commercial operations, cross-country planning, weather implications, and then it goes more to a scenario-based where you can be tested on the aerodynamics and emergency procedures for the aircraft. After which, if you do this successfully, of course, you get to go to flight operations, action planning, and then go out to do your pre-flight for your aircraft and be able to do your practical exam. So again, this is really meant to be the oral portion of that, and I hope that you get some benefit out of it as you listen to the points that I'm going across. I will try not to go too deep into each of the points because then it will become a 3-hour video. I'm trying to keep it into about 45 minutes. So I'll try to point out where, the importance of each of the points and what you should dive into so you can make it a point for yourself to really master that piece of the puzzle. All right, let's get started. It is a couple minutes into it already. And I hope you find value in this. And of course, leave me any comments in the section below on YouTube. Okay, so first thing is PAVE. What I did, I prepared a PAVE PowerPoint presentation and made a booklet out of it to really take it all apart. So it had physical examples of each of the questions that could come to me. So that would be a memory jogger, but also be able to show that I have laid this out in a way that I can help articulate that. But again, straight and forward, right? It is starting off with the documents that are required in the aircraft. So Aero comes to mind. Right, so lay it out clearly that airworthiness certificate, registration, radio if you're in Canada, operating, and weight and balance. Again, be able to talk about that, where you can find this information in the aircraft and where it is located. And of course, the pilot operating handbook for your particular aircraft in flight should be laying on the table next to you. So once you have that completed, it is about weight and balance. Now, you and I both know that we rarely do a handwritten weight and balance. So make sure you have that done well in advance. Interesting enough, I had mine prepared for my oral exam, and I came in an hour and a half early to be able to make sure that I got settled, that my nerves are under control, that everything was laid out in the way I wanted, only to find out I was going to be using a different aircraft. So a different aircraft requires a new weight and balance. Well, the last one was already printed and completed. I had done some time ago. This time around, of course, I needed to make adjustments, and I had to remember how to do this manually. And if you want to scramble, then you know what it is like, because of course, weight times moment equals, right? And then it sounds simple, but laying it out on paper and doing it, especially when you're under a little bit of a time crunch because the exam is starting in half an hour, 45 minutes. Try to stay well ahead of that. Practice it a couple of times at home so it's not so complicated. It doesn't require a lot of brain power on your part. So weight and balance is something that you can fully expect. And the second part of the weight and balance is not just in your takeoff weight and balance, but also the arrival weight and balance. You have to be able to show the shift both in a lateral, front to back, and left to right aspect, and have the ability to talk and articulate why that is important, especially if you have to make, if you add weight or decrease weight, depending on the circumstance, density, altitude, and other factors that go into play. Again, be able to articulate that. The next is about the aircraft logbooks, both for the engine and for the frame. Again, don't wait until the last moment. Review these documents well in advance. Put even tabs inside of the logbooks itself so you can easily find your 50 hour, your 100 hour, your ADs, your special dates that you need to remember to be overhauled for the entire or for parts of the aircraft itself. There should be no question about that. You should be able to find easily your transponder, your ELT, your VOR, if that's if you have an IFR aircraft, on when that was last tested and when is it due again. These things are expected to be, and again, if you have to search for them, it doesn't show that you are prepared. So again, make sure you laid it out, bring some tabs with you, question comes up, you can quickly and easily show all the pertinent things you need to have about the aircraft in order to be able to articulate that. So here's the next, a little bit more difficult talking point is when we start talking about the MMEL and the MEL. So if you go to your FAR AIM book at 91-205, you can read the descriptives, and I would say to you, look at that in detail and know that for your particular organization, and know that for your particular aircraft. For the simple fact is that the MMEL and the MEL are two different types of documents. One is a manufacturer, one could be the owner operator. But to know what that means for your particular aircraft and be able to articulate that is important, because the next question, of course, what to do with inoperative equipment, that is 91-213, and the question will be asked, if something happens with X, can you fly this aircraft? And you have to refer back to the MMEL or the MEL in order to be able to answer that question. Just by saying, listen, I put a placard on it, label it as out of service, and then I can fly it, might not be good enough for your aircraft because it depends on what is required. Now, of course, if you fly like I do in Robinson 44 aircraft, you might have another obstacle on the way, that they have a separate list, right? That's a manufacturer's list of things that you have to take into consideration that you need to have operational before you can fly. Then, of course, on the back end, make sure that you understand how a ferry flight permit is obtained from your FSDO, and how that can be used to go from point A to point B in order to be able to get something repaired. Again, the question will inevitably come up, and you need to be able to talk about that. And then it is to more of the standard question. The question that you have probably covered in your private, in your IFR, if you have done that, and now your commercial, is about performance limitations. Now, it is both performance limitations of the aircraft, right? How fast can I fly under different weight scenarios or weather circumstances, or what is my max performance, or my continuous max performance. Again, these are standard questions you should be able to answer, but again, refer back to a memory pad, right? I've made placemats, and I'll share them at some point in time, with all of these details on it. So if you have let's call it a brain fart, then you can go back to the performance limitations of your particular aircraft, right? And there, if you go to the Pilot Operating Handbook, where of course you can find this information, it is something that you can quickly refer to, right? Using a checklist is perfectly fine. You do not need to remember everything outright. Of course, certain things in case of emergencies need to be practiced over and over and over, so you have instant recall, because it's difficult to find a checklist, especially in an aircraft where you need to fly with 2 hands and 2 feet. Next thing is around the engine and rotor limitations, and the conversation can go into this a little bit about what type of rotor blades do you have? What are the coning hinges? What is flapping? What is it that you look for as you are inspecting your aircraft before each flight? So know and understand how the mechanics work of the aircraft itself, and all of the hinges and all of the hardware. So if the question comes up, you're able to articulate. And of course, in your walk around later, in your pre-flight inspection, questions can come up with that. And certainly, I felt that was more done in my private and my commercial, but certainly the expectation is to know and understand that. Now, we did not go this time into very much depth of what are cylinder head temperatures, what is the oil temperature, oil pressure, or fuel gauges. Again, these things were often addressed in the private. Again, if you can competently answer the questions about your operating limitations and your engine and blade limitations, often you can skip over that. But again, use your checklist to be able to talk about these things. Now, warning lights. So the warning lights are easily skipped in the oral portion because it becomes more of a part of the practical. And, we go over them and we test them, of course, every time we go out, the chip lights for the main road and the tail and the fuel and this and that. My question came up is that the fuel auxiliary pump light came on. What to do? Right. Well, the initial is, of course, that it is about, are there any signs and symptoms of any problems? Aviate, navigate, communicate, and land as soon as practical, and have this checked out. Right. It's not an emergency at that point in time. But if you add a fuel filter light, now it becomes an emergency and you land immediately. Again, you have to clearly, quickly be able to articulate the progressive steps that lead to something goes from a practical to immediate to, like, if you have a tail road out, that you can go to an auto rotation, right? Or you have an engine out, there's an auto rotation. That's, of course, is the obvious one. So know and talk a little bit, especially if we're in flight, about warning lights to take care of. So the mechanical fire and the electrical fire, tech failure, emergency engine failure, both at hover and in flight, tail rotor failure, abnormal vibrations, carb icing, which obviously in my Raven 2 is not a non-issue, is not something that you will deeply dive into because it is a real practical application during the flight portion itself. And we covered most of them during the flight portion as I travel from point A to point B to perform maneuvers. Carb icing, if you, of course, flying an R22, be very aware of that, right? It is something that you have been taught and you have been doing over, probably by now 100 plus hours, as you have done your VFR, IFR commercial, and should be second nature to you. To me, that's more of a foreign entity because I've never flown a helicopter with carb heat. Of course, I have plenty of time in an airplane with carb heat issues. And then the question around the transponder requirements, 91125 in the FAR AIM, if you have to go back to that, of course, it is the requirement of what air spaces you need to have a transponder, but also, 24-month inspection of the transponder itself. Know that. And, we are just outside the New York City Class Bravo airspace, and we have obviously Mode C rings around our Class C and B airspaces. So be able to talk about that and how that is applicable to your flight pattern, especially, the cross-country flight portion that you had to plan for. And for me, was going through the Mode C ring, although we were able to avoid, the Bravo airspace by flying underneath one of the shelves itself. So that is the aircraft portion of the PAVE. So where do we come in with the questions around the pilot? So we are talking a little bit about what class do you need to have for a commercial pilot? Yes, the class is a class 2, right? And if you don't have a class 2, you default back to a class 3. If you're over 40 years old, how long is it good for? If you start reading in the FAR AIM book itself, it can easily confuse. But go back to the first line that says there, it's every 12 months you need to get a physical examination by a certified flight surgeon, and that is that's the right answer for that. So again, know where to find that information if you need to refer back to that, and that is important. The second, of course, is that if the class 2 expires, you fall still back to a class 3, and a class 3 for somebody over 40 years old needs to be every 24 months, right? So that is, and then we can talk about, what are you supposed to carry as a pilot in the aircraft while flying? Of course, you need to have a government ID, picture ID. You need your license itself. You need to have some sort of an ID to go along with that in the aircraft. So with that said, you really go into, what are the wind limitations? Now, of course, the wind limitations under 200 hours, which includes probably most of us who are still learning how to fly or getting our CFI II. It is not only the wind limitations, the 25 knots, but the question is, what is your personal limitation at this point in time? So it is important to recognize your own abilities and to be able to articulate that. And if I say, listen, during my private, I would say probably 10 to 15. While at this point in time, I feel comfortable flying at 15 to 20. But would I say 20, 15 to 20, gusting 25, 30? I probably say, listen, I skip today and I'll come back another day to fly. So again, know what your personal limitations are for a particular flight. That again shows competence and at least some thought process, or what we call really good ADM, right? Aeronautical decision making, and crew resource management in that sense. Standard questions are how many days do you have when you change your address? Of course, it's 30. Your medical certificate, the currency, day and night for the helicopter. We're going to be key differences, of course. 90 days for day and night. 3 touch and goes during the day. 3 touch and goes with a full stop at nighttime. Then we get into the question around oxygen requirements. Again, it's very simple, straightforward. Over 15,000, everybody needs to have it. It needs to be provided to the passengers. But the more important question is go back to it. That as a helicopter pilot, you could be transporting people on vacation areas, right? If you end up flying tourists, asking the question of their, have they been diving, and have they gone to any certain depth of diving, right? There's a distinctive difference between people who dive 60 feet or below, or 0 to 60 feet and decompression. So nitrogen buildup in the blood can become a real issue if you start flying above a certain altitude. Now, we are not flying at 10, 15,000 feet in a helicopter, of course, but it is an pertinent question to ask because you want to be cautious about it. And then how many hours? Is it 8 hours or 24 hours? Know where to find this information. 91211 in the FAR inbook. Again, go back there and open it up and show and talk about what the requirements are for oxygen during flight and for diving considerations. Now, here's the tricky question for commercial. And I would highly recommend you to use use a checklist for that. How can you get paid? Right, that hanging out the tile. Is this something that is just common practice and common for your operations, or is there something, a special consideration that you have to take into account? I find the language in the FAR book extremely confusing, and I think it's almost done on purpose. That you before you make a decision, go ask a person who owns the operation, owns the helicopter, or go to the FDSO in order to be able to get a clarifying question. Make sure that you're doing the right thing. Again, the easy answer is, listen, it's a pro rata, no different than your private, that everybody pays an equal part of the aircraft, and you're pretty safe. Of course, as a commercial pilot, the intention is at some point in time that you're going to get paid for the service that you provide. Know and understand the difference. I would suggest making up a list of all the things that you can do that is common carriage and otherwise, so you can talk about. And again, that little distinctive of, where do we start and finish? Do I start at my home base and finish at my home base? Do I go 25 nautical miles or not? Again, know and dive into that. Make up the list. Don't try to remember it, but make up a list so you have a point of reference. With that, 61.113 in the FAR book is your point of reference where you can get additional information. But if you need to read that all in order to understand it at the time of the exam, I think it might be very difficult. So be mindful of that. And then the last one was the NTSB reporting, knowing and understand the difference between an incident and an accident. Anytime you say holy shit, you might want to notify them, right? But there are some distinctive differences between an incident and an accident. Something that needs to be reported immediately, while as soon as the accident and the scene has been stabilized, the scene is safe, patients are taken care of, and then NTSB is notified, or something that requires a follow-up, and that can either be requested or that is mandatory. Again, in the book at part 830, you can find all of the answers and be able to learn how to talk about that. And again, what is helpful is having a couple of scenarios, right? If there's an engine failure or an engine component failure in flight versus a propeller strike while taxiing back there's a two different reporting requirements. One is immediate, the other one is delayed. But know the difference between the two and be able to speak to that. So then it goes into the aeronautical, factors. Now, as a paramedic for over 30 years, these are, of course, the easy guinea. So we didn't spend a whole lot of time on that because I can talk about and teach each of the subject matter pretty easily. I do want to say that highlight the fact about vision. How does hyperventilation or how does night vision, what implication does it have on your ability to fly? And what are the limitations, or what are the things that you need to take into consideration, or what are the early signs and symptoms of hyperventilation, or night vision itself, or how you can ruin night vision, your rods and your cones. I would look that up. Again, I put it as my PAVE checklist with the detailed information. So again, if a question came up, I can certainly dive a little deeper. I think the most pertinent question of all is a question around fatigue. Because, if you read NTSB report, it is exceptionally rare, right? 5 or 10% that this is mechanical failure. It's often is pilot error. So pilot aeromedical decision making is making the right decision for you as a person. Am I ready to fly? Fatigue is one of those things that we tend to be in denial about. And you can have chronic fatigue, over a long period of time. You can have situational fatigue, which of course is something that is permanent. Alcohol consumption before flying, another good question to understand. Again, the nuances to that, and all of that stuff you can find. So the alcohol and drugs, question is that, listen, you shouldn't take anything unless it's on the approval list. You shouldn't drink anything really 24 hours before you fly. But the fine print is really, you need to be at 0.04 or below. Or there can be, again, there are little nuances that you need to know and understand in order to be able to know that. Again, you see how this all works? They blend it into a type of a scenario, right? How high do you fly? What are your limitations? What could happen if you go diving, the bends? How can you, what does fatigue have? How does alcohol work? What drugs can you take? Again, build a scenario around that for yourself so you can able to articulate that and use it again as a point of reference on your checklist or something to talk about. So that was really about it on the aircraft pilot and aeromedical. Now we really shifted more into the environment. And the environment was about commercial operations, obviously for the commercial oral exam here. And so we started a little deeper diving in. Again, what are the approved operations for a commercial operator, both Part 91 and 119? And then we talked a little bit more about the management of aircrew and passengers or off-airport considerations. So what is your responsibility when you do a briefing to your passengers, right? If you do, if you do a flight with, let's say, down to New York City, or you do a flight for an operation that goes from point A to point B. Again, what is your responsibility to the passenger itself? And a briefing is required. Again, there's an acronym you can use for briefing. You can keep that with you and memorize it over time, so you have a set way of maybe to articulate. Again, the most important part is stay away from the back of the aircraft, right? Explain that you cannot see a tail rotor spin at 5,000 RPMs, right? It is that you have to stay away from it. If anything happens, always exit and go to the front of the aircraft, not to the back of the aircraft. But talk about the fact that you seatbelt use and how to lock the door, how to get out of the door in case something happens, how not to reach or touch things during a flight. Use that, a set way of being able to provide a briefing to your patient, to your passengers, is an important piece of the puzzle, right? It very much speaks to safety. When it comes down to off-airport operations, of course, helicopters can go just about anywhere. And, we have class G and E, A, B, C, and E to think about. But we have, other than noise pollution and common courtesy that we have to provide, we have the opportunity to essentially speak and land just about anywhere. The key thing is if you're going to do an airport landing in an area that is owned, but make sure that you have permission to do so. The joke is always, well, listen, I have an engine light coming on. I need to land immediately in order to be able to check this out. Is a cover for all. Yeah, that is true, but that's not the right way to operate an aircraft in a responsible manner, of course. Again, be ready to talk a little bit about off-airport operations and permission in order to be able to, to operate and land. And the best way to learn is to go to many different sites. And one of my training flights, I went to a backyard of a friend of mine, and I got permission before landing there. right? And making sure it was in a safe condition to do so. Then we shifted to our cross-country flight plan. So I don't know if you can see it, but I did the old paper chart at home in order to be able to demonstrate not that I can not only use for flight, but I can still do it the old-fashioned way as well. Now our cross-country flight was going from Stewart Air Force Base, SWF, or our home base is 76 NY, to ISP on Long Island, Farmingdale. And the interesting part of that is that as a commercial operator, you want to go as straight and as fast as possible. Now, as you depart, on a straight line from our base, you actually have to fly over a restricted area of West Point, so that requires you to make a slight alteration to the flight path itself. Now, interesting, there's an 85 NY helipad that you can use as a visual point, what we call through the gap, and then have it pretty much a straight line flight. A couple of things along the way as you start looking at the flight path. I said, how high? What is our altitude? Is there any Class D airspace in between? Yes, there's White Plains is in between, and I believe, at the top of my head, they go from 0 to 3,000. Well, at 3,000 or above, you have Class B airspace right there as well, and you're already in the Mode C ring, outside for a requirement to be able to have an ADS-B in and out. So all these things you have to kind of take into consideration. What is the flight path? And then, for this particular purpose, is you have to fly over a body of water. Now, we know that in a helicopter, in order to be able to fly over a body of water over a certain distance, there are other requirements like life vest or flotation devices. And of course, we have to fly at an altitude. If we have an engine failure, we need to be able to glide from point A to point B. Your pilot operating handbook is your point of reference on what your glide distance is and what altitude you need to fly at. Of course, the alternative, if you are right at the cusp of that, right, if you're at that 3.5 mile gap at a mile and a half in between, you're flying at 4,000 feet, you should be able to glide to land with that. Or you can shift your course of travel more inland, where the distance over water becomes shorter. Again, the test of the oral exam is to really see and evaluate if you have thought this out well, and of course with safety first and foremost. Now, interesting enough, flying in around New York City, you have helicopter airways, you have a helicopter chart, you have very, very busy 3 airport LaGuardia, JFK, and Newark in your area. Plus, you have you have Farmingdale as a Class D, you have Islip as a Class C. So you all things that you have to take into consideration. But there is a path to do this and to be able to fly almost outside of, underneath the Class B, so you do not ask for a transition from point A to point B through Bravo airspace. But again, you can have lots of conversation around that. So I would recommend making sure that you have a paper chart that's up to date. Lay it out on the chart itself and make some notes on the periphery on what frequencies to talk on. What are your backup plans in case you cannot, you have nobody else to talk to and you need to go back to flight following? Who should you call? Where should you call? What should you say? All things that are memory joggers that you don't feel like you're, especially if you're flying and you have limited means. It is, when you become anxious, adrenaline starts rushing. Your vision becomes more narrow. It is harder to recall. So writing things down on paper, and of course in the aircraft, I probably more likely to use my notepad on my for flight, so I have instant recall of information. That is part of the planning itself, right? And that is something that you will have a pretty in-depth discussion around. And then, of course, you always go to the sectional and the terminal and the helicopter chart looking for symbols. And I've had the same DPE now for both my private instrument and now my commercial. And I always say at some point she's going to run out of symbols that I have never seen before. But she always seems to find just one or two more. You should study them. But again, you don't need to rely just on memory, right? Because there's so much stuff to remember. Know that you have a legend. Right, and I have my legend on my telephone that I picked out before flight, and I made a picture of. I can zoom in and out, and I was able to look at, okay, what is this? Let me verify that this is that. And we went to sea base, to oil tanks, to tracks or borders, and we ended up in Round Lake, New York, looking at, hey, what is this? We have interesting layout over here of two runways labeled, and said, what is that? So can you go back to your supplemental and look at Round Lake and be able to get a description, or diving a little deeper into it and seeing and understanding both the a 3D picture of it. One was a description of the land-based field, and the other one was a description of the lake itself. Again, there are nuances of things that you don't see, and it's kind of unique. Again, it's good to review the chart and the legend in order to be able to really understand how it all works and comes together. I always said in the future as a CFI, the two things that I would like to do with my students is to build a chart from nothing, right? An induced VFR chart. So by building it yourself, hopefully you get to remember that in a different way. And then I would also do plates, certainly approach plates, and have them build an RNAV for an ILS or a localizer. By building these things yourself as components, almost as a puzzle, really you're able to lock these things in much better. Again, everybody learns a little different. I'm more of a tactile learner in the process itself. So, all right, quick time check. It's 9:43, so I have a few minutes left. Let me take a look at it. So, we did not spend a whole lot of time on the navigation log because it's pretty simple, straightforward. Know and understand your loss procedure, loss of communication, and light gun signals. We did not cover that, but again, I had a little cheat sheet on the side in order to be able to address that if necessary. And these are questions that you likely covered in your private as well. Then we went into weather, our most favorite, right? And I always say right up front, listen, I'm knowledgeable about weather patterns, but I am not a meteorologist. So as a safe pilot, 1-800 weather brief or an online briefing and actually speaking to somebody is my preferred way of understanding the weather patterns, especially if I'm flying away from my home base. If I'm at my home base and I'm looking outside and I get a quick, AWOS from Orange County and quick ADIS update from Stewart, then I know that I'm okay for the next hour, right? That's usually an hour and a half flight of practice around the airport and be able to come back. I can still see the weather coming if anything comes over the hills out of the west or something out of the south, the southeast, that I can make it back. But that's not good enough when you do your cross-country flight planning. Because you need to think hours ahead, right? What could happen, what could change. So be able to have that laid out. So I told you up front, I had printed out my briefing. So I can go to the METARs and the TAFs, and I can look at the prognostic charts, the 12-hour, the 18-hour, the 24-hour. I can look at the wind charts. I can look at the frost levels. I can look at the things that are important. Of course, you can go over the NOTAMs that are in. So I learned something new this week, not during the exam, as was actually after the exam. I came across a NOTAM that was specifically a drone NOTAM. And there is a layer available now on your chart that will show you where there are no drone zones that you need to be aware of, right? And one of the most dangerous pieces with things in the air today are drone operators without licenses that are flying over 400 feet, and certainly a drone hitting a tail blade might do some real damage and potentially cause real harm. I'm not so sure that the main rotor would be all that affected by a small drone, but again, you have to be aware of these things. So know that there's a little layer that you can do that you can look at and see where there are no drones or where there's drone activity, right? Is both something to take into consideration. We talked a little bit, of course, about the typical clouds, fog, icing conditions, and there's a standard, right? Those are, I think, the expectations that you have knowledge about. Go back to reading a non-detailed, right, and procedural METAR and TAF. So one of the things that you can read the first line, but sometimes when you go to a METAR, it is where you have the from this time to that time, and then you have detail below that, I still tend to struggle on those things to be able to smoothly talk about these things. And I think that's where I told you up front that my knowledge is in here, but I can read it, but I cannot always orate it well. So it's important to be able to take the time to read them and become fluid at reading them in shorthand, because it is important information, especially if you have certain pieces of the puzzle. There's a quick shower coming through, or quick snow shower coming through. All these things are embedded, and it is the expectation. Now, in the weather briefing in ForeFlight, when you put in your trip from point A to point B, leaving at X time, right, an estimated departure time, an estimated arrival time, the nice thing is that ForeFlight will highlight any of tabs, METARs, or any other information during your time of flying. Now, that is helpful, but don't be dependent on that. The second thing is that when you print out radars, imaging, or look at radar itself, always remember that radar imaging is about 15 minutes behind actual. So if things are moving and you think that they're still in Pennsylvania, well, 15 minutes later, they might be 20 or 30 miles closer to where you are. So be mindful of that as you go through your weather information on that. And then we shifted into a scenario-based. So our scenario was that you're doing a photo flight. It could be anywhere, of course. It is, we did a photo flight scenario over one of the newer buildings in Manhattan, right? By the main road that splits the northern and the southern part of Grand Central Parkway. Central Park in Manhattan itself. That during the photo flight, suddenly you feel a vibration take place, and you have loss of control of heading of your obviously there's something that happens with your tail boom. Now the right answer at that point in time is really twofold. Either A, I immediately enter an auto rotation and be able to go in for a landing in Central Park, put the aircraft down, and save yourself and your passengers. The second part, of course, you can also, and depending on where you are, is if you still have enough momentum, you can establish a 70 knot, straight flight, which then should help control the tail itself, where you can take it to any one of the airports, preferably at that point in time, most likely LaGuardia. White Plains a little further away, and Teterboro would be on the other side of the river, to be able to come in for an auto rotation. So reducing the power, taking the collective and overspring as you're going in for a landing, especially if you start picking, when you start picking up the collective again. So the correlator doesn't add power. Add power means more rotation and, of course, losing control of the aircraft. But able to clearly articulate that in a succinct way. Now, of course, scenarios could be any scenario, right? So this is just one of the scenarios. But it is good to be able to talk through these things. Can you anticipate one? Hey, listen, the tail boom, tail rotor, malfunction is a good one, right? But you can have hydraulic, you can have electrical fire, you can have a smoke condition, you can have an engine that quits. You can have all kinds of different scenarios. So work through those a bit for yourself in order to be able to bring them up and to be able to think about that. Now, the next part that you then go to is the aerodynamics and emergency operations. Now, there's no time for 3 hours to go into all of them, but there's certainly things that are going to be highlighted that can incorporate many of them at the same time. And one of the areas, because there's again all that information, how do I get that out of my head and be able to talk about these in a good way? So in my case, I got messed up a little bit. I got a little bit confused when we was talking about rotor RPM degrading and stalls and stall areas. And but if I think about it, right, and you're allowed to talk through these things and to slow down, I was able to articulate it the right way. But sometimes it took a little bit of time to really put it all together. So again, practice makes perfect. And I think that's where my deficit was, that I had not orated these things. I think about these things. I watch video clips. Jake's 10-minute lessons are phenomenal. I highly recommend it. A lot of these things, I can draw the pictures. I can see the picture. I can see the airflow. I can see the stall, the driving, the driven. I can think about, the V. All these things I can do. But how can I take it out of my head and put it into words so I can actually sit in front of the DPE and look like I'm competent, right? At the end of the exam, I'm giving myself a B minus at best on my ability to orate that. Now, is the knowledge there? I have no question about that. I think I've studied enough and understand the aerodynamics that I'm not an A. I'll get there, right? Through the teaching component of the CF and CFII, I'll get to that A. But I can certainly I think I can do better than I did. And again, the encouragement is to you sit with your body and explain it to somebody who has never flown an aircraft before, so you can learn to become more competent in about and how you can orate these things. So let's go through a couple things. So we talked a little bit about rotor systems in our scenario itself, the tail rotor, transfer flow lift, of a transfer flow effect in ETL, especially when we talk about the right tendency. We didn't go too deeply into it, but there was a conversation piece of that, of course. A ground resonance, but that's more of an articulated, a three-bladed system, same thing as the harmonic and sympathetic resonance. Loss of tail rotor effectiveness, the LTE. We talked a little bit about, having winds coming from the left side of the aircraft, on how that can potentially impact. We discussed that in depth during my private, so it was a little less at this point in time. Settling with power, we did talk about what is the tendency, when it can occur, what are the recovery processes. You have, of course, two types: the Vishar maneuver for the least amount of altitude loss, and if the scenario can call for it, you can be able to fly straight and away, and by picking up speed, of course, it have a tendency to lose a little bit more altitude. We talked a little bit about the gyroscopic precession. And then I think that really, when we started talking about the symmetry of lift, and the retreating blade stall, that's when it started kind of, all a little bit morphing about, okay, what is this? What is that? Again, for yourself, and I had notes, my placements have everything spelled out to what is each scenario, what is the proper recovery of each of the scenarios. So I did refer back to that in order to be able to get the story straight, right, to say the right things. And that's when we started going into the requirement, the SBAR requirement for Robinson helicopters in particular, right? And we started talking about, you have the three buckets of energy, right? You have, and how do you manage them along the way, especially in an out of rotation. But we talked specifically about, push over low G scenario. When would that happen, and what would happen to the aircraft? Why is there not only, why is there an issue when you push over that there's a potential strike happen for the tail boom, but why is there a right roll? All these things, I think it's really important to be able to articulate that. I could have done a better job at that. I had the information, I had, my cliff notes on it, I had visuals on it, but to be able to clearly articulate it, make sure that you're ready for that, because again, it will save your life, right? It is that yes, I'm not going to push over the helicopter like I would push over an airplane. I understand that is not to be done. But what happens if you're in a wind condition, you have certainly turbulence or wind shear, and you end up in a pushover scenario involuntarily, right? How to recover from that is really, really the important part, right? It is that again, the tendency to want to recover the roll first before making the adjustments on reloading. Again, know and talk about these things, why that is important. I would, design it in a way that you could put things into the, altitude, airspeed, and energy, RPM, as the three buckets of energy, and how to trade those things off in order to be able to have enough energy left at the bottom when you are, when you want to make the flare. Right? The flare is really to push more air to it so you can actually have a cushioned landing. Make sure that you're able to talk about that. And in future videos, as I learn how to teach these things, I'll come back and talk about them in greater depth. So I too can, again, practice, right? Talking to the camera is a great way to practice. All right, I had a couple of minutes left here before I have to go on to my next meeting, so to speak. That is really about it, right? That's the oral exam itself. And then you start, transitioning from there into the pre-flight. Now, the words of wisdom that I learned along the way is make sure that you come in before the oral exam and you do an in-depth review of the aircraft itself and you have done all of that as the aircraft decided moved out, but you already have fuel levels and oil levels and hinges, and you climbed on top of it. Because the last thing you want to feel like is you're rushing the process itself. But if you have that done and the aircraft is moved, always go back and just double check the things. Make sure there's fuel. Make sure that the belts are in proper working order. Making sure you look at the cage, making sure that all of the hinges, and again, take a walk around. And then as the DPE comes out, emphasize clearly that you are doing a passenger briefing before the person steps into the aircraft itself, and ask them if they have any questions. So I'm going to stop the conversation here, and I will pick it up and actually doing an overview of the practical flight itself in the next video. I hope you found this beneficial. And again, there's really nothing to find on the helicopter oral exam. So I hope this is a little bit different and nuanced for the helicopter specifically, versus what all the different examples you have out online for airplanes. Have a wonderful day. Come check me out at thedutchmentor.com, where I am, actively coaching and mentoring emerging leaders. And of course, I encourage you to follow me at Fly with the Dutch Mentor on YouTube. Ask any question. That's how I learn best. I love doing a little research, and education, of course, is something that helps other people get better, including myself. Right? Teaching is nothing else but a really good reminder on what you need to know. Take care, and we'll talk at the next video.